Commander Elias Trent stood motionless in the smoldering ruins of what was once a thriving human colony. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint crackling of embers that danced over the charred remains of buildings. His hand trembled as he picked up a small, scorched toy, a plush bear with one eye missing. The soft fabric was blackened, but its innocent design was still recognizable. It had belonged to a child, one of the 800,000 children who had lived here before the massacre. Elias clenched his jaw, the weight of failure pressing down on him like a collapsing star. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burned lives. Around him, the skeletal structures of homes stood like broken tombstones, a macabre monument to the Galactic Empire's unthinkable atrocity. It was meant to be a warning, a demonstration of their power and ruthlessness. Instead, it had ignited something within Elias that could not be extinguished. Rage mingled with sorrow, fury sharpened by resolve. Elias activated his holorecorder, a small sphere that floated before him, projecting his face across every known communication channel in the galaxy. His voice, low and steady, carried the weight of the grief and rage that burned inside him. "To the Galactic Empire," he began, his words slicing through the heavy air. "You have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. 800,000 children, innocent lives, slaughtered in cold blood. You sought to break humanity. Instead, you've given us a reason to rise." He paused, letting the silence carry his unspoken threat. The camera captured his steely gaze, the lines of his face hardened by years of war and loss. "This is not a plea. It is not a negotiation. It is a warning. Flee now while you can, because if you do not, your worlds will burn." The message ended, but its echoes lingered in the air. Elias deactivated the recorder, letting it hover back into its compartment. He turned, his boots crunching on the ashen ground as he walked toward his shuttle. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Zara Rain, awaited him at the ramp, her expression a blend of admiration and concern. Zara, with her fiery red hair tied tightly behind her head and piercing green eyes, was a figure of unwavering loyalty. "That was one hell of a transmission," Zara said, falling into step beside him. "Think they'll listen?" Elias glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Number. But it's not about them listening. It's about making them fear." As they entered the shuttle, the atmosphere inside was a stark contrast to the desolation outside. The crew was tense, their faces pale but determined. These were the last remnants of humanity's fleet, a ragtag collection of soldiers, engineers, and civilians who had survived the Empire's relentless onslaught. They were weary but unbroken. Elias moved to the command console, his presence commanding respect. "Status report," he ordered. A young officer, barely out of his teens, snapped to attention. "Fleet scattered across 5 sectors, sir. Supplies critically low. We've intercepted Empire communications. Admiral Kyrix has dispatched a fleet to hunt us down." Elias nodded, his mind already working through the implications. Kyrix was a name he knew well, a ruthless tactician with a reputation for leaving no survivors. The Empire was not taking his warning lightly. "Then we'll make them work for every inch," Elias said. "Plot a course for the Talmar Rift. It's treacherous, but it'll buy us time to regroup." The officer hesitated. "Sir, the Rift's gravitational anomalies—" "I know the risks," Elias interrupted, "but we don't have the luxury of safety. Get it done." The officer saluted and hurried off, leaving Elias and Zara at the console. Zara studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "You're not just trying to buy time," she said. "You're planning something." Elias didn't answer immediately. He stared at the star map displayed on the console, his finger tracing the path of the Talmar Rift. "We need to show the galaxy that humanity isn't done, that we're not just survivors. We're a threat. The Empire needs to see us as more than victims." Zara folded her arms. "And how do we do that?" Elias's gaze hardened. "We hit them where it hurts. Their pride, their resources, their belief in their own invincibility. We make them bleed." Before Zara could respond, the ship shuddered violently. Klaxons blared, and the crew scrambled to their stations. "Report!" Elias barked. "Empire ships incoming," the young officer called from his station. "3 destroyers on intercept course. They must have traced our broadcast." Elias clenched his fists. "Battle stations. Zara, take the helm. Prepare for evasive maneuvers." The shuttle erupted into controlled chaos as the crew snapped into action. Zara slid into the pilot's seat, her hands moving deftly over the controls. Outside, the void of space lit up as the Empire's destroyers unleashed a barrage of plasma fire. "Shields holding, but barely," an engineer reported. "Return fire," Elias ordered. The shuttle's cannons blazed, scoring hits on one of the destroyers. But it was clear they were outmatched. Elias's mind raced, weighing options. They couldn't win this fight head-on. "Zara, take us into the debris field," he said, pointing to the wreckage of an old asteroid mining operation visible on the sensors. Zara shot him a look. "You're serious?" "Deadly," Elias said. "The field's dense enough to disrupt their targeting systems. We use it to lose them." The shuttle veered sharply, plunging into the maze of jagged metal and rock. The destroyers followed, their plasma cannons carving glowing paths through the debris. Inside the shuttle, the crew held their breath as Zara navigated the treacherous terrain with precision born of necessity. "They're closing in," the young officer warned. Elias gritted his teeth. "Not for long. Zara, head for that derelict freighter. Use it as cover." The shuttle skimmed past the rusted hull of the freighter, narrowly avoiding collision. The destroyers, larger and less maneuverable, struggled to keep up. One clipped a piece of debris, spiraling out of control before exploding in a fiery burst. "Direct hit!" the engineer exclaimed. "2 more to go," Elias said. "Keep moving." The chase continued, the shuttle weaving through the debris field like a hunted animal. The crew worked in unison, their fear giving way to determination. As the second destroyer closed in, Elias spotted an opportunity. "Zara, cut thrusters and reverse course. Now." She didn't question him. The shuttle abruptly slowed, spinning to face the oncoming destroyer. The sudden maneuver caught the enemy off guard, and the shuttle's cannons fired at point-blank range, tearing through the destroyer's hull. "Last one," Zara said, her voice tight. The final destroyer hesitated, its pilot clearly reconsidering the pursuit. Elias seized the moment. "Transmit this message to their captain," he said. "You've seen what we can do. Tell Kyrix we're just getting started." The destroyer veered away, disappearing into the blackness of space. The crew let out a collective sigh of relief, but Elias's expression remained grim. This was only the beginning. As the shuttle cleared the debris field, Elias stared out at the stars, his mind already turning to the next move. The Empire thought humanity was broken. They would learn, soon enough, just how wrong they were. Admiral Kyrix stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Fury, watching the aftermath of the failed ambush unfold on the massive holoscreen before him. His crimson uniform, pristine and adorned with medals, seemed to radiate the arrogance of a man who had never known defeat. Yet the sight of 2 destroyed destroyers and 1 retreating vessel left his angular face tight with fury. "Explain this incompetence," he demanded, his voice like steel grinding on stone. A trembling officer stepped forward, sweat beading his brow. "Admiral, the humans utilized the debris field to their advantage. Their shuttle—" Kyrix cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I am not interested in excuses. Commander Trent has made a fool of us twice now. I will not tolerate a third." His cold gaze swept over the bridge crew. "Send word to all nearby fleets. I want every ship hunting them down. Block their escape routes, sever their supply lines, and leave them with no sanctuary. Is that understood?" The officers saluted in unison, and Kyrix turned his attention back to the holoscreen, where Elias Trent's warning still played on loop. The human's words were a thorn in his pride. "Flee now, or your worlds will burn." Kyrix sneered. "Burn us? We shall see who burns." On board Elias Trent's shuttle, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The crew, having narrowly escaped the Empire's trap, scrambled to assess their situation. Zara Rain sat at the helm, her sharp eyes scanning the star charts for their next move. "We can't stay here long," she said. her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the ship. "The Empire will regroup, and they'll be sending reinforcements. That field won't save us twice." Elias nodded, standing with his hands clasped behind his back. He exuded a calm authority that steadied the nerves of those around him, even in the direst circumstances. "I know. Plot a course for the Talmar Rift," Zara's brow furrowed. "The Rift? That's treacherous. I know," Elias interrupted. "But it's our best chance. The gravitational anomalies will buy us time, and time is what we need to regroup." Zara hesitated, then nodded, trusting his judgment. "Course set." As the shuttle prepared to jump, Elias turned to the young officer who had earlier warned of the Empire's pursuit. "Lieutenant Varek, update me on the fleet." Varek straightened, his youthful face pale but determined. "Sir, our ships are scattered across 5 sectors. Communications are spotty, but we've managed to establish contact with a few groups. Supplies are critically low. Food, fuel, and munitions, everything's running dry." Elias's jaw tightened. He had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud made the weight of their situation even heavier. "Send word to all ships. Tell them to converge on the coordinates I'll provide. We need to consolidate what we have if we're going to survive." Varek saluted. "Yes, sir." As the young officer moved to carry out the order, Zara glanced over her shoulder at Elias. "Consolidating the fleet is one thing, but we can't fight a war with empty guns and hungry soldiers. What's the plan, Elias?" Elias leaned against the console, his gaze distant. "We make alliances, even with those we'd rather not." Zara raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking of the Sindara?" "They owe us," Elias said simply. "And right now, we can't afford to be choosy about who we trust." The Sindara were a nomadic alien race known for their advanced scavenging capabilities and questionable morality. Years ago, during the early days of the Empire's expansion, humanity had provided them with sanctuary when they were hunted for their technology. That debt was a card Elias intended to play. The shuttle exited hyperspace near the Sindara enclave, a sprawling web of interlinked ships that drifted in the shadow of a gas giant. Elias and Zara donned their tactical suits and boarded a small transport pod, leaving the shuttle in orbit. As they approached the Sindara's primary vessel, Zara couldn't hide her skepticism. "Do you really think they'll help us?" she asked. "The Sindara aren't exactly known for their loyalty." Elias gave her a wry smile. "Loyalty is overrated. Survival, on the other hand, is a universal language." The pod docked, and they were met by Sindara guards, tall, insectoid beings with segmented exoskeletons and multifaceted eyes that glinted in the dim light of the docking bay. Their leader, a Sindara named Krez, approached with an air of practiced indifference. "Commander Trent," Krez said, his voice a low, clicking rasp, "I never expected to see a human here again, especially not you." "Desperate times," Elias replied, his tone even. "We gave your people refuge when no one else would. Now I'm calling in that favor." Krez tilted his head, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "You humans have a peculiar sense of timing. The Empire has put a price on your head that would make even the boldest of us hesitate." "Yet here I am," Elias said, meeting Krez's gaze without flinching. "Because I know the Sindara. You thrive on chaos, and what I'm offering will give you more opportunities than you can count." "And what is it you're offering?" Krez asked, his tone skeptical. Elias stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The Empire thinks they've broken humanity. They're wrong. We're building something, Krez. Something that will change the balance of power in this galaxy. Join us, and when we rise, you rise with us." Krez studied him for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Finally, he let out a clicking laugh. "You always were good at making impossible promises, Trent. Very well. The Sindara will hear you out. But if you betray us," Elias smirked, "you'll regret it. I know." Back aboard the shuttle, Elias and Zara reviewed the terms of the alliance with the Sindara. The Sindara would provide critical supplies and intelligence in exchange for a share of whatever spoils humanity might claim in the future. It wasn't an ideal arrangement, but it was enough to keep them afloat. "They'll turn on us the moment it's convenient," Zara said, crossing her arms. I'm counting on it, Elias replied. By the time they do, we'll be ready. The crew worked tirelessly to distribute the supplies brought aboard from the Sindara. The shuttle's cramped quarters were alive with activity as engineers repaired damaged systems and soldiers checked their weapons. It was a small victory, but it was enough to kindle a faint spark of hope. That hope was short-lived. An alert blared through the ship, and Varek's voice crackled over the intercom. Empire ships detected on long-range sensors. They've found us. Elias strode to the command console, his mind racing. How many? 6 destroyers, Varek reported. And they're closing fast. Elias turned to Zara. Plot a course for the Talmar Rift. We need to move, now. The shuttle's engines roared to life as it leapt into hyperspace, the stars stretching into streaks of light. But Elias knew the reprieve was temporary. The Empire was relentless, and their pursuit would not end until either humanity or the Empire was destroyed. He stood at the viewport, watching the void of space blur past. In the distance, the Talmar Rift loomed, a storm of gravitational chaos that could either save them or destroy them. Elias tightened his grip on the console. The hunt was far from over, but he would not bow. Humanity's fire still burned, and he intended to stoke it into an inferno that the galaxy would never forget. The Talmar Rift was a nightmare of gravitational storms and swirling debris, a place where even the most advanced navigation systems struggled to function. To the untrained eye, it looked like a void filled with chaos, a churning storm of shifting light and shadow. For Elias Trent and his battered crew, it was salvation, or as close as they could hope for in the midst of an unrelenting hunt. The shuttle emerged from hyperspace, its shields flaring as they brushed against the rift's volatile edges. All systems operational, Zara reported from the helm, her voice steady despite the strain etched into her face. But this place is no sanctuary. The longer we stay, the more strain it'll put on the ship. Elias stood behind her, his hands gripping the back of her chair. His eyes never left the viewport, where the rift's chaotic beauty played out in violent flashes. We don't need long, just enough time to regroup. The bridge was silent, except for the faint hum of the ship's engines. Elias knew the crew was exhausted. They'd been running on fumes, both literally and metaphorically, for far too long, but there was no time for rest, not yet. Lieutenant Varek, Elias said, turning to the young officer. Status on the fleet? Varek's fingers danced over his console, pulling up fragmented reports from the scattered remnants of humanity's forces. We've managed to make contact with 4 more ships, sir. The Resolute, Haven's Light, Vanguard, and Stalwart. They're en route to our location, but it'll take time. They've been avoiding Empire patrols just like us. Elias nodded. Any word from the others? Nothing yet, sir, Varek replied, his voice heavy with the weight of too many losses. But we're still trying. Elias turned back to Zara. Broadcast a signal, low-frequency encryption. I want every remaining ship, every survivor, to know where to find us. We're done running blind. It's time to come together. Zara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. And if the Empire intercepts it? Elias's jaw tightened. Then we'll be ready for them. As the crew worked to coordinate with the remaining human ships, Elias retreated to the small briefing room where a makeshift war council awaited him. Zara, Varek, and Dr. Valen Thorne were already seated at the long table, their faces illuminated by the flickering holographic map of the Talmar Rift. The map showed the positions of the incoming ships, the scattered remnants of humanity's fleet slowly converging like pieces of a broken puzzle. We've made contact with some of the fleet, Elias began, his tone measured. But it's not enough. We need more ships, more resources, and more unity if we're going to stand a chance against the Empire. Dr. Thorne, a gaunt man with sharp features and perpetually furrowed brows, leaned forward. Unity won't come easily, Commander. You've seen the fractures in our leadership. Some want to surrender. Others want to strike back recklessly, without a plan. And then there are those who simply want to survive. I'm aware of the divisions, Elias said, but we don't have the luxury of time to indulge them. The Empire isn't going to wait for us to sort out our differences. "And what about your plan to strike back?" Zara asked, her arms crossed. "You've hinted at it, but you haven't shared the details." Elias took a deep breath. "We've been on the defensive for too long. It's time to change that. Dr. Thorne, what's the status of the weapon?" Thorne's expression darkened. "The prototype is functional, but it's untested. If we deploy it, there's no guarantee it will work as intended. And even if it does, the moral implications—" "I'm not asking about morality," Elias interrupted, his voice sharp. "I'm asking if it will work." Thorne hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, it will work." "Good," Elias said, "because when the fleet arrives, we're going to use it to send a message the Empire can't ignore." The following hours were a flurry of activity as the crew prepared for the arrival of the scattered fleet. Supplies were rationed, weapons were checked and rechecked, and the ship's systems were pushed to their limits to maintain communications in the Rift's turbulent environment. Despite the urgency, there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that, for the first time in a long time, they were taking the fight back to the Empire. Elias moved through the ship, speaking with the crew and offering words of encouragement where he could. He knew they were tired, scared, and uncertain, but he also knew they were capable of more than they realized. As he entered the engineering bay, he found Zara supervising a team of technicians who were working on a damaged shield generator. She looked up as he approached, wiping sweat from her brow. "How's it coming?" Elias asked. "Slowly," Zara admitted. "But we'll get it done. We always do." Elias nodded, then lowered his voice. "I know this isn't easy, for any of us, but if we can hold out just a little longer—" Zara placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "We'll make it, Elias, because we have to, for them." She didn't need to specify who them referred to. The weight of the children's deaths hung over all of them like a storm cloud. It was both a wound and a driving force, pushing them forward even when the odds seemed insurmountable. By the time the first of the fleet's ships arrived, the crew was ready. The Resolute was the first to dock, its captain, a grizzled veteran named Captain Dara Kell, stepping onto the shuttle's deck with an air of defiance that mirrored Elias's own. "Commander Trent," Kell said, extending a hand. "It's good to see you alive." "Likewise," Elias replied, shaking her hand. "We're gathering as many as we can. The others should be here soon." Kell glanced around, taking in the shuttle's cramped quarters and weary crew. "You've done well to hold out this long. But what's the plan, Trent? What are we fighting for?" Elias met her gaze. "We're fighting to show the Empire that humanity isn't done, that we won't bow, and that when we strike, it'll be with the force of every life they've taken from us." Kell studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Count me in." Over the next several hours, more ships arrived, each bringing with them stories of survival and loss. The captains and crews were a patchwork of humanity's remaining strength: military officers, civilian engineers, and even a few mercenaries who had thrown their lot in with the resistance. They were far from a cohesive force, but Elias knew that unity could be forged in the fires of necessity. As the fleet assembled, Elias gathered the captains in the shuttle's briefing room. The holographic map now displayed the positions of their combined forces. A fragile web of hope stretched across the chaos of the rift. "This is it," Elias said, addressing the group. "We've been scattered, hunted, and nearly broken, but now we stand together. The Empire thinks they've won, but they've underestimated us. They've underestimated what we can do when we're united." The captains murmured their agreement, their expressions a mix of determination and grim resolve. "We're not just fighting for survival," Elias continued. "We're fighting for justice, for every colony they've destroyed, for every life they've taken. And we're going to show them that humanity doesn't break. We rise." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the ship. For the first time in months, hope burned bright in their hearts. They were still outnumbered and outgunned, but they were no longer alone. The fleet was coming together, and with it, the promise of retribution. The galaxy would soon learn that humanity's spirit was unyielding, and its wrath unstoppable. The Talmar Rift had bought Elias and his fleet time, but it wouldn't hold the Empire back forever. The rift was a temporary haven, not a fortress. The fleet needed more than survival. It needed a plan to turn the tide, and Elias had one. As the assembled ships drifted in the relative safety of the rift, their captains and crew worked tirelessly to repair damage, redistribute supplies, and prepare for the next phase. On the Resolute, Elias stood before a hollow map. His trusted leaders gathered around him. The map displayed their position relative to the Empire's fleet, which was drawing closer with every passing hour. "This is our opportunity," Elias began, his voice calm but firm. "The Empire is overconfident. They think they've broken us, and they're chasing us into what they believe is a final confrontation. We're going to use that arrogance against them." The room was silent, every captain and officer hanging on his words. Zara leaned against the edge of the hollow table, her arms crossed. "You're thinking of the nebula, aren't you?" Elias nodded. "The Marathi's nebula is less than a day's jump from here. Its gravitational instability makes it nearly impossible to navigate, but it also makes it the perfect place to set a trap." Captain Darakel, a grizzled veteran from the Resolute, frowned. "A trap? With what? We've barely got enough firepower to hold off a single destroyer, let alone an entire fleet." "That's where the Sindara come in," Elias said, gesturing to the map. "Their scavengers have been collecting explosive materials from derelict ships in the region for years. With their help, we can rig the nebula to detonate. The Empire's fleet won't know what hit them." The room erupted into murmurs, some of approval, others of doubt. Dr. Valen Thorne, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Commander, even with the Sindara's help, this plan is extremely risky. The nebula's instability could trigger a chain reaction that destroys not just the Empire's fleet, but ours as well." "I'm aware of the risks," Elias said, his tone measured. "But we don't have the luxury of safe options. The Empire has more ships, more resources, and more soldiers than we could ever hope to match. If we fight them conventionally, we lose. This is our best chance." Zara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the debate. "Elias is right. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about sending a message. If we pull this off, the Empire will think twice before underestimating us again." The room fell silent again, the weight of the decision settling over everyone. Finally, Captain Kell nodded. "If this is our shot, then we take it. But we better make damn sure it counts." Elias allowed himself a small smile. "It will. Now let's get to work." The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Elias split the fleet into teams, each assigned to a specific task. One group would escort the Sindara scavengers into the nebula to deploy the explosives. Another would serve as a decoy to draw the Empire's attention, and the remainder would stay on standby, ready to strike once the trap was sprung. Zara took charge of the decoy team, her natural leadership and quick thinking making her the ideal choice. As she prepared to depart, Elias pulled her aside. "Be careful out there," he said, his voice low. "The decoy team is going to be the first thing the Empire targets." Zara smirked, her confidence unwavering. "Don't worry about me. Just make sure your trap works. I'm not getting vaporized for nothing." Elias chuckled despite himself. "Fair enough. Good luck, Zara." "You too, Commander," she replied before heading to her ship. Meanwhile, Elias joined the Sindara aboard one of their scavenger vessels, overseeing the deployment of the explosives. Krez, the Sindara leader, moved with a deliberate efficiency that belied his alien form. The Sindara were strange allies, their insectoid exoskeletons and clicking voices unsettling to many humans. But Elias had come to respect their resourcefulness. "You humans are a curious species," Krez said as he worked. "Driven by revenge, yet willing to risk everything for survival." "Revenge and survival aren't mutually exclusive," Elias replied, watching as Sindara engineers carefully secured a massive explosive device to a piece of nebula debris. "The Empire thought they could break us by taking everything we cared about. Instead, they've given us something to fight for." Krez tilted his head, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the dim light of the ship. "I admire your resolve, Commander. Let us hope it is enough." As the Sindara continued their work, The tension aboard the ship grew. Every minute spent in the nebula increased the risk of detection or a premature detonation. Elias paced the command deck, his mind racing with contingency plans. Finally, the explosives were in place. The Sindara ship withdrew from the nebula, rejoining the fleet just as the Empire's ships arrived. The decoy team, led by Zara, had done their job well, drawing the Empire into the heart of the nebula. Elias watched from the bridge of the Resolute as the Empire's fleet began to spread out, their massive destroyers cutting through the swirling gases like predators closing in on prey. Admiral Kyrix's flagship, the Eternal Fury, was at the center of the formation, its imposing silhouette a reminder of the power humanity was up against. "Wait for my signal," Elias said, his voice calm but commanding. The fleet's captains relayed his order to their crews, everyone holding their breath as the trap drew closer to fruition. On board the Eternal Fury, Admiral Kyrix studied the nebula with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. He had heard the reports of humanity's desperate gambit and dismissed them as the actions of a species on the brink of extinction. "Deploy the fleet in a pincer formation," Kyrix ordered. "Flush them out." His officers moved to carry out the command, unaware of the danger lurking within the nebula. The explosive devices, rigged to trigger a massive chain reaction, were strategically placed to catch the Empire's fleet in a deadly crossfire. Elias watched as the enemy ships moved into position. His hand hovered over the control panel, ready to send the detonation signal. The tension on the bridge was palpable, every crew member focused on their stations. "Hold," Elias said, his voice steady. The Empire's ships were almost in position, but not quite. They needed to be deeper into the trap for the plan to succeed. The Eternal Fury advanced, its sleek hull cutting through the swirling gases like a blade. Kyrix's voice echoed through the Empire's comm channels, ordering his fleet to close in. Elias's hand tightened into a fist. "Now!" He pressed the control panel, and the nebula erupted. The detonation was instantaneous, a blinding flash of light, followed by a shock wave that rippled through the void. The Empire's ships, caught in the heart of the explosion, were torn apart in a cascade of fire and debris. The Eternal Fury was rocked by the blast, its shields straining to hold against the onslaught. Elias watched the destruction unfold, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. The trap had worked. The Empire's fleet was in disarray, their arrogance turned against them. But the battle wasn't over yet. "Engage," Elias ordered, and the fleet surged forward, striking at the surviving Empire ships with renewed vigor. The nebula burned, and with it, humanity's message was clear. They were not broken, they were not defeated, and the Empire had made a grave mistake in underestimating them. The Marathi's nebula was a battlefield unlike any other. Churning clouds of gas glowed with the residual light of the massive explosion, casting eerie shadows across the remaining Empire ships as the human fleet surged forward. The wreckage of destroyed destroyers floated aimlessly, their hulks torn apart by the blast. For the first time in years, the humans had the advantage, and Commander Elias Trent intended to make the most of it. On board the Resolute, Elias stood at the command console, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the bridge. "Focus fire on the lead destroyer," he ordered. "Don't let them regroup." The human ships moved with precision, their smaller size and agility allowing them to outmaneuver the Empire's hulking warships. Plasma fire streaked through the void, illuminating the battlefield in bursts of white and blue. The Empire, accustomed to being the hunter, now found itself the hunted. Zara's voice crackled over the comms, her tone a mix of exhilaration and urgency. "Elias, the decoy team is in position. We're keeping their rear flank occupied, but we can't hold them for long." "You won't have to," Elias replied. "We're cutting through their line now. Stay alive out there." Zara's laugh was sharp and unyielding. "Always." As the battle raged on, Admiral Kyrix paced the bridge of the Eternal Fury, his expression thunderous. The destruction of his fleet was an insult he could barely comprehend, let alone tolerate. "Pull the remaining ships into a defensive formation," he barked. "Concentrate fire on their command vessel. We may have underestimated these vermin, but they will still die." Kyrix's officers scrambled to carry out his orders, but it was clear their morale had been shaken. The Empire's fleet had never faced such a devastating loss, and the once imposing destroyers now hesitated in their movements, their captains wary of another trap. On the Resolute, Elias could see the shift in the Empire's tactics. They were pulling back, regrouping, but not retreating. Kyrix was too proud for that. He'd fight to the last ship if it meant salvaging his reputation. "Dr. Thorne," Elias said, turning to the scientist who stood at a secondary console, "is the weapon ready?" Thorne's face was pale but resolute. "It's armed and operational, but once we deploy it, there's no turning back. This will be as much a message to the galaxy as it is to the Empire." Elias nodded. "That's the point." The weapon, a massive experimental energy cannon mounted on the Resolute, had been humanity's last-ditch effort to level the playing field against the Empire. Designed to harness the unstable energy of the nebula itself, it was a weapon of unparalleled destructive power. "Target the Eternal Fury," Elias said. "Admiral Kyrix needs to see what humanity is capable of." The crew moved quickly, inputting coordinates and aligning the cannon with painstaking precision. The tension on the bridge was palpable, every officer and technician acutely aware of the significance of what they were about to do. As the cannon powered up, its hum grew louder, reverberating through the ship like a heartbeat. The energy readings on the console spiked, glowing red as the nebula's volatile gases were siphoned into the weapon. "Firing sequence initiated," Thorne announced. 10 seconds to discharge." Elias's gaze never wavered from the viewport, where the Eternal Fury loomed like a wounded beast. "Let Kyrix watch," he said quietly. "Let him understand." The cannon fired. The blast was a blinding arc of energy, cutting through the void with terrifying precision. It struck the Eternal Fury head-on, its shields buckling under the onslaught. For a moment the ship seemed to hold, its armor glowing white-hot, but then the energy pierced through, tearing a massive hole through its hull. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, the shockwave rippling outward and disabling several nearby Empire ships. On the Resolute, the crew erupted into cheers, but Elias remained silent, his expression unreadable. The destruction of the Eternal Fury was a victory, but it wasn't the end. "Admiral Kyrix's flagship is down," Zara reported over the comms. "The rest of their fleet is in disarray." "Press the advantage," Elias ordered. "Don't let them recover." The human fleet surged forward, targeting the remaining Empire ships with renewed vigor. The smaller vessels darted between the massive destroyers, exploiting every weakness in their armor. One by one, the Empire's ships fell, their captains overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of humanity's assault. On board one of the last remaining destroyers, an Empire officer transmitted a desperate message to Kyrix's command channel, unaware that his admiral was already dead. "They're everywhere. We can't—" His voice was cut off as his ship exploded, the comms falling silent. By the time the battle ended, the Empire's fleet was decimated. Only a handful of their ships managed to retreat, their engines flickering as they limped away into hyperspace. The human fleet, battered but victorious, held its position, watching as the remnants of their enemies disappeared into the void. On the Resolute, the bridge was filled with an almost surreal quiet. The cheers had died down, replaced by a heavy sense of relief and exhaustion. Elias stood at the command console, his gaze fixed on the viewport. "We did it," Zara said, stepping up beside him. "We actually did it." Elias nodded, but his expression remained somber. This was just the beginning. The Empire will come back, and next time, they'll be prepared. We need to make sure they think twice before they do. He activated the ship's holo recorder, standing tall as it floated before him. This transmission would be broadcast across the galaxy, to every corner where the Empire's influence reached. "To the Galactic Empire," Elias began, his voice steady and commanding. "Today you've witnessed the cost of underestimating humanity. You sought to break us with fear and violence, but all you've done is forge us into something stronger." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "This is your only warning. Flee now while you still can. Because if you come for us again, we won't stop with your fleets. your worlds will burn." The transmission ended, and Elias deactivated the recorder. He turned back to Zara, his expression resolute. "Prepare the fleet for repairs and regrouping. We're not done yet." As the human ships began to organize themselves, Elias allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the children who had been lost, their lives cut short by the Empire's cruelty. He thought of the countless sacrifices that had been made to get to this moment. And he thought of the future, one where humanity was no longer a fractured, hunted species, but a force to be reckoned with. The galaxy had underestimated humanity. That was their mistake, and Elias Trent intended to ensure they never made it again. The wreckage of the Empire's fleet drifted through the churning remains of the Marathi's nebula, silent and lifeless. Fires still burned on the hulls of shattered destroyers, casting flickering orange light across the expanse. For the first time since the massacre of humanity's children, the Empire had been dealt a blow it could not ignore. Commander Elias Trent stood on the bridge of the Resolute, surveying the aftermath. His expression was as unyielding as the void beyond the viewport. "We've routed their forces," Zara said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. She leaned on the console, rubbing her temples. "The survivors are fleeing. Their pride won't let them call it a retreat, but that's exactly what it is." Elias nodded, his gaze locked on the distant flashes of engines from the Empire's limping ships. "They'll regroup. They'll come back, smarter and angrier. This isn't over." "It's never over," Zara muttered, folding her arms. "But for now, we've done what we set out to do." Elias turned to face the bridge crew, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the ship. "You've all done something extraordinary. Against impossible odds, we've sent the Empire a message they won't forget. This victory is as much yours as it is anyone's." The crew broke into scattered applause, the sound a mix of relief and pride. For many, it was the first true victory they had experienced since the war began. But Elias couldn't afford to revel in the moment. There was still too much at stake. "Lieutenant Varric," Elias called, and the young officer snapped to attention. "Begin recovery operations. Search for survivors and salvage what we can from the battlefield. Every scrap counts." "Yes, sir," Varric replied, immediately relaying orders to the fleet. Dr. Valen Thorne entered the bridge, his face pale and drawn. The use of the experimental energy weapon had clearly taken a toll on him, both physically and mentally. He approached Elias with measured steps. "The weapon performed as expected," Thorne said, his tone clinical. "But the residual energy in the nebula has become highly unstable. We need to withdraw before the entire region becomes uninhabitable." Elias nodded. "Understood. How long do we have?" "Hours, if we're lucky," Thorne replied. "But I wouldn't push it." Elias turned to Zara. "Coordinate with the fleet. I want all ships out of the nebula as soon as recovery operations are complete." As the crew worked to execute his orders, Elias retreated to the war room, where a holographic map of the galaxy displayed the current positions of the fleet. He stood alone, his hands resting on the edge of the table, lost in thought. The victory at the nebula had bought humanity time, but it had also painted a target on their backs. The Empire would not let this humiliation stand. Elias knew they would retaliate with a ferocity that dwarfed anything humanity had faced before. The fractured remnants of the fleet were still too vulnerable, their resources too limited. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Zara entered, her expression unreadable. "You look like you're planning your next 3 wars," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Just the next one," Elias replied, his voice heavy. "We're not ready for what's coming, Zara. This victory might have given us hope, but hope isn't enough to win a war." She crossed the room and stood beside him, her green eyes scanning the map. "So what's the plan? Hide and rebuild? Or take the fight to them?" Elias considered her words carefully. "Both. We'll consolidate our forces, rebuild our fleet, and secure alliances with anyone willing to stand with us. But we can't afford to wait for the Empire to strike first. We need to keep them on the defensive." "And the weapon?" Zara asked. "Thorne's not thrilled about deploying it again." "We'll use it if we have to," Elias said, "but only as a last resort. It's a tool, not a solution. Zara studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but you know they're going to call you a monster for what we've done. Elias met her gaze, his expression unwavering. Let them. Better a monster than a victim. As the fleet began its slow exodus from the nebula, the scattered ships formed up into a more cohesive formation. Captains reported in, their voices crackling over the comms with a mixture of relief and determination. The victory had not been without cost. Several human ships had been lost in the battle, their crews sacrificing themselves to ensure the trap succeeded. In the medical bay of the Resolute, Elias visited the wounded. The makeshift facility was overcrowded, with medics working tirelessly to stabilize patients. As he moved through the room, he stopped to speak with the injured soldiers, offering words of gratitude and encouragement. Their resilience was a reminder of why he fought so hard. One soldier, a young woman with burns covering her arms, looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Commander," she said, her voice trembling, "did we really win?" Elias knelt beside her, placing a hand on her uninjured shoulder. "We did. Because of people like you." Her tears fell freely now, a mix of relief and pain. I thought we'd never see this day." "We'll see more like it," Elias promised. "Because we're not giving up. Not now, not ever." The fleet finally cleared the nebula, the battered ships drifting into the relative safety of open space. Elias called a meeting of the remaining captains, gathering them on the Resolute for a strategic discussion. The mood in the room was somber but resolute, the weight of their collective losses heavy on their shoulders. "We've struck a blow against the Empire," Elias began, his voice carrying through the room. "But this war is far from over. They'll come back. And when they do, they'll come with everything they have. We need to be ready." Captain Dara Kell, her grizzled features lined with exhaustion, spoke up. "What about the rest of the galaxy? The neutral factions, the ones sitting on the sidelines? If they don't join us now, they'll wait until it's too late." Elias nodded. "Agreed. We need to show them that humanity isn't just fighting for itself. This isn't just our war. It's a fight for freedom, for every species oppressed by the Empire. We'll send envoys to the neutral factions, show them what we've accomplished here. And if they won't join us willingly—" Zara raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking of coercion?" "Persuasion," Elias corrected. "We don't have the luxury of playing nice anymore." The captains exchanged uneasy glances but ultimately nodded in agreement. They all understood the stakes. Later that night, Elias stood alone in his quarters, staring out at the stars. The weight of command pressed heavily on him, the faces of the fallen haunting his thoughts. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the scorched toy he had found in the ruins of the colony, the little bear that had once belonged to a child who would never grow up. "We did this for you," he whispered, "for all of you." There was a soft knock at the door. Zara stepped inside, her expression softer than usual. She didn't say anything, simply standing beside him and looking out at the stars. "Do you think they'd be proud of us?" Elias asked after a long silence. Zara placed a hand on his shoulder. "I think they'd want us to keep fighting. For them." Elias nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we will." The galaxy had been forever changed by the events of the Marathis Nebula. Humanity, once seen as weak and broken, had proven its strength. And though the road ahead was fraught with danger, Elias Trent knew one thing for certain: they would not walk it alone. The fight was far from over, but humanity had taken its first step toward reclaiming its place among the stars.